thank you, Mara. It's so good to be with all of you. Shabbat Shalom. Um, yeah, I'm really excited, especially for this particular Parsha, to be guiding us in a little bit of learning and a little bit of discussion and a little bit of study together. So we are in Parashat Beshalach, which is the fourth parasha in Sefer Shmot. If you've not been with us in the last couple of weeks, just a quick summary of where we are, very broad brushstrokes of where we are. Our parasha is a peak moment for Bnei Israel. Our parasha is really a time of deep, deep freedom and ecstasy, and also profound fear and uncertainty and doubt, and all of these different pieces. We have begun our journey out of Egypt last week in Parashat Bo. We were moving in that direction. We learned about the Passover offering, and this week in Beshalach, we are actually in process. We are traveling. The Torah portion opens describing our journeys as we're leaving Egypt. And then, of course, the thing that our parasha is most famous for, in fact, our Shabbat this week is known as Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath of Song. And there are a lot of concerts, that happen on Shabbat Shira or afterwards, often in different communities around the Jewish world, do lots of different things for this Shabbat. Why? Because we have one of the most glorious songs in the Torah that we sing at the seashore. We sing upon the miracle of the splitting of the Yam Suf, of the Sea of Reeds, and the Egyptian army tries to pursue us, and ultimately we are able to cross safely on dry land. And what's interesting there is that we sing this very substantial song, really glorying in the miracle that has happened. And there's a very famous, at least in some parts of the Jewish world, at least parts that I'm in, there's a very famous verse that shows up for the first time in the Torah in that song. We're not going to really dig into it, but I do want to spend a minute on it because it's a beautiful verse that's been set to music by several different composers. I can name a few off the top of my head. Um, Ozi v'zimrat ya, vayehi li lishua. Ozi, my strength, the Zimrat Yah, and the song of God, Vayehi, and they will be to me, li lishua. They will be a sense of redemption, salvation. It's a complex verse because it could also be understood as my strength and song. And, there's lots of different ways to really connect to it. But it's the sense of really connecting to that which is greater than we are. And that song, that verse rather, often gets, or can in certain parts of the Jewish world, gets sung to a very particular melody. It's also part of the verses that we say at Havdalah, the end of Shabbat. It also shows up in Hallel, which is said at times of great praise, particularly the festivals and Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the new month, and on Hanukkah as well, and other times of the year in certain communities. And so there are ways in which our parsha shows up all the time liturgically. Another one that I just wanted to point out before we really move into what we're going to song today is that the song at the sea, Shirat Hayam, which, as I mentioned, is the key or the peak moment, we could say, in our parsha, this appears in Psuke de Zimra, at least in the liturgy that Ashkenazi communities from Eastern and Central Europe say. I don't know other liturgical rites. That's the technical term. I don't know other liturgical rites well enough to know if the Song of the Sea shows up there, but um, in the prayers, as have been said by communities that follow Ashkenazi tradition, this song is actually said every day by many, many people as part of the preparatory part of the service called Psuke de Zimra. That's just a little bit of background on how this song shows up. We're not going to focus today on it, but I felt like I couldn't do a shiur on Beshalach without talking about the song because it is such an important thing and it's what most people think of when they think of our parsha. So what we're going to do today is we're going to, and in a minute, we'll have a screen share. Um, take a look at some verses from Exodus 16. This is the chapter that happens immediately after the Song of the Sea is sung, and we've had this peak moment. Uh, and then the question arises, and there's a really beautiful phrase that the Jewish Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield uses after the ecstasy, the laundry. It's actually the title of a book that he wrote that I am very excited to look to read very soon. Um, and the notion there is when you have this peak spiritual experience, what happens after that, right? Collectively, the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, has had this tremendous miracle. The sea has actually split. There was a wall of water on our left, there was a wall of water on our right, and we crossed on dry land, which is a wonder that this people that had been so caught in a narrow place in Egypt had never before experienced. And so, of course, from that place, often, and even in our own lives, we can have a sense of desire to praise or desire to express gratitude or whatever that is. What happens in the waning days and months after? I can certainly speak from personal experience, and I don't know if anyone else in this room has experienced this. I attend meditation retreats on a fairly regular basis. It's part of my practice. And sometimes you are in that experience and you've been working with your mind and very concentrated and doing all of the things and participating in that experience, which is a really, really precious thing to do. And sometimes after you can experience a bit of a dip, a bit of a, you know, kind of figuring out like, here I am, I've had this experience in this beautiful community, and now I'm not in that community anymore. And how am I going to take this and integrate it into the rest of my life? Or, something really amazing can happen in our lives, and we have that moment of elation, like, wow, this is amazing, this thing happened. And then we kind of experience a little bit of a crash. What do we do in that moment of crash? The Torah addresses this in a really complicated way. And I'm going to be using today a little bit of teaching from one of my teachers, Rabbi David Jaffe, with whom I work quite closely. I'm going to be drawing a bit from his teaching on this particular section of Torah. And I want to really approach the text as though we've never read it before. There are a lot of layers that many of us have received in different ways from the text we're going to read, which is all about the manna and how we got the manna and what the purpose of the manna was. But I want to encourage us to think about looking at this text as if we've never experienced it and thinking about the questions that may be arising for us. What's going on here? I framed it for us as a narrative arc that the people have had this high experience, this peak experience, and are now a month later and are in the wilderness and are in a very, very different place. So, what I want to invite now, if we can have a reader. Now, if you would like to read, please read the English. I will pause you, so please don't be alarmed when I jump in. Um, but I'm going to invite you to read. I'm looking now to make sure I can give folks a good stopping point. Um, I want to invite a reader, if you are interested, to start with chapter 16, verse 1, and to through go through at least verse for now go through at least verse 10. And I may again, as I said, I may pause, I may interrupt and adjust as we go. But in the English, if you are prepared for that, or if you'd like to read a couple of verses and then turn it over to someone else, that is also completely fine.
We'll go to
But
our esteemed reader, Ginny, who
amazing!
we're
Yay!
blessed to
Let's
have
get
her
started.
voice often. So
Amazing. Perfect. Let's do it.
ready when you are.
Okay. Setting out from Elim, the whole Israelite community came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. In the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by God's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death." And God said to Moses, "I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "By evening you shall know it was God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall behold the presence of God, who has heard your grumblings against God. For who are we that you should grumble against us? Since it is God," Moses continued, "who will give you flesh to eat in the evening and bread in the morning to the full, because God has heard the grumblings you utter, what is our part? Your grumbling is against God, not against us." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole Israelite community, 'Advance toward God who has heard your grumbling.'" And Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community. They turned toward the wilderness, and there in a cloud appeared the presence of God.
Amazing. We'll stop there for right now and we'll probably pick this back up. Thank you so much, Janine. That was wonderful. We may be calling on you again. Thank you for your beautiful reading. These, these 10 verses here. I want to invite, we're going to pause now, and I want to invite any comments, particularly in the chat. Anything you noticed, and we can, if you're okay with this, we can read a few of those aloud. But I want to pause and just give folks an opportunity now to drop your wisdom, your questions into the chat. It's coming for you in these first 10 verses. There's a lot happening here.
Kathy is noting what I was also noting. They're complaining a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's some fear, a lot of anxiety, very little trust. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great starting point, and we'll take some more comments in a moment. Yes, there is a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. And it's understandable, right? Spoiler alert, I wrote this week's commentary for My Jewish Learning, so a little bit of what we're doing today is going to be a further exploration of that. So I encourage you, it's called Manna for the Soul, so feel free to look that up. Um, there's a certain way in which we begin, right? ויסעו מעילים, ויבואו, ויבואו כל עדת בני ישראל על מדבר סין, right? So we're already in the beginning of this section of Torah by noticing that the Israelites, and we're going to see this theme pop up a lot again in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, which we'll be reading this summer, as we do every summer. We notice that this people is traveling. They are not settled anywhere yet, right? We're not settled anywhere. We've left Egypt. We've left this place that we knew, even though it was awful. We're not going to, in any way, in any shape or form, romanticize or downplay or pretend it wasn't. It was awful. And I recognize in my own intellectual humility that I just don't know what that felt sense of just how awful it was is, and none of us do. So we have to really use that imagination to think about what was it like in the felt sense for Bnei Israel to have been in this awful, awful place of enslavement for centuries. So now they're traveling, they're not settled, they're camping, they're moving. So think about the stress on the body, right, of moving from one location to another. It's been a month. We're told that it's the 15th of Iyar. It's a month after the Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's a month after the Exodus. And they're getting hungry and they're getting tired. And I want to invite us to think like, of course they're getting hungry and they're getting tired. They've been traveling for a month and they're with these leaders who, yes, there have been amazing miracles that have happened for them, but they don't really know Moshe very well. They don't really know Aaron very well, right? There's not really a way in which the people have a connection, a relationship with these people who've taken them out. And the way that Moshe responds in particular, if like you're grumbling against God, you're not grumbling, why are you yelling at us? It's not us, it's God. There's a lot that we can ask about the leadership piece, but I would just name and frame for us the context of why Bnei Israel is so unmoored, really. Often I think when we read the Torah, when we read this week's parsha, when we will later in Parashat Ki Tisa with the golden calf, even next week in Parashat Yitro, which there again is a peak moment. In Parashat Yitro next week, we've literally received the Torah at Har Sinai, another amazing miracle. And what happens after that? The people panic. They say, "Oh my gosh, we cannot get too close to this mountain. We're going to die if we do. Moshe, you've got to do this for us because we can't handle it." It's a theme that repeats itself over and over and over again. But I'm finding this year as I'm reading Torah again, I just feel so much compassion for our ancestors. I'm just like, of course they were freaked out. Often there are a lot of people who, there are a lot of commentaries that can frame that as, well, if they had had more faith, they would have not been panicking. They would not have been upset. They would have just gone with it. And as somebody for whom emunah is just not a natural thing for me, right? Like it is a constant work in progress. That is not something that I come towards easily. I really can understand why these people are, why our ancestors are so worried and so nervous. And where is the nourishment going to come from? Where are we going exactly? And we knew where we were, as bad as that was. And again, not romanticizing. It was terrible. But how often is it that we in our lives tend to imagine a past that was better than it actually was because it was familiar, right? Sometimes we stay in places or do things or make choices because those choices feel familiar to us in some way, which I think is what exactly is happening for our ancestors. And so I'm going to pause there and I want to invite either on off mute or in the chat. I really, really want to hear from you other things that you noticed in these verses, things that are coming up for you, things that, wisdom that you would like to add. I really want to make this a very collaborative, co-learning space. So I'm going to turn it back over to your chat and comments.
Yeah, we have a lot of really wonderful comments in the chat. It seems like Betsy Stark's comment is getting a lot of folks are resonating with it. If Betsy is here, would you want to share your comment out loud in your own voice, or I'm happy to read it for you. Let's see if I can see Betsy's hand. Okay, if your hand's raised, Betsy, I can't see you, but I will attempt to bring voice to your thoughtful comment. Betsy says, oh, here we go. Great. Thanks, Betsy.
Hi, I wrote, their experience has been being controlled by slave owners on the outside. They have no confidence in being independent or being able to take care of themselves. And I think their concept and ability to lean into inner resources is just unknown. And maybe this is the very beginning of it being developed.
Thank you.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other responses to that from the chat or from the community?
I want to, we have someone raising their hands and I don't want to mispronounce your name. Will you share how to pronounce your name before your comment?
Yeah, it's Roxana.
Thank you.
The one that just wrote, because it occurs to me this is kind of like, it's like an eclosion or it's like a birth process. You know, when you're giving birth to something and you're like at that very end and everything is horrible and you're like, you know, you just want it to be over. I feel like that, like that's kind of what I see. Like, and it's liberating because like, you know, if you think of that thing stuck in there and then there's like traveling through this canal, and if you can think of it from being on the inside or being on the outside, but to me it seems like a birthing process and like, you know, a whole terrifying unknown thing. And you know, there's all sorts of things that you go through if you've ever been through that process, or if you can just imagine a seed splitting open or something. But that process needs to happen in order for the growth to, like, in order for us to get to the other side. So I don't know, I just really feel like that's a struggle that everyone has to go through in life to become themselves. And like we can all see it collectively and in history. So I just can't, it's really a very powerful theme. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Rabbi
Absolutely,
Lauren,
yeah.
excuse me, Rabbi Tuchman, there's a few more comments both in the chat and we have hands raised.
Amazing. Let's take them all. I'd love
Okay,
to hear
great.
from folks.
We'll go to Andrea and then Susan.
I just find it interesting that the text treats all of the children of Israel as if they were one person, that there's no diversity. You know, I find it hard. You know, I look at what's going on even in our society today, and there are people who there should always be people who push back against the apathy and the pissing and moaning these people are doing, and I find it interesting that that's not captured at all in the text. It's these very passive, complaining Israelites and two leaders, one of whom is reluctant, and it's just a funny framing to me. It's sort of unreal.
Thank you for that. Yeah, do we have any other comments?
We'll go to Susan.
It didn't do them much good to be quiet, because in the beginning of Shemot, we hear, you know, they were enslaved for years, and then finally, when they cried out, God heard them. And things were tough before that. God wasn't doing anything. No one was doing anything. So if they want something, if they need something, they have to speak out or speak up. And that's true for everyone. No one's going to know what you need or want if you remain quiet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Susan. Any other raised hands, or why don't we move to the chat?
Here's Ellen.
I was really intrigued by that comment on, you know, one unified voice. And for me, it comes from, like, very much when I look at this and look at many biblical things, you know, I see the human hand. And in this way, I see it like oral storytelling versus like the kind of story you would get in a very dense novel where you fill out the characters and put a little bit more voice to them, whereas this is more like, you know, mythological or, you know, hero journey storytelling where it's like beginning, middle, end, plot, blah, 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 blah. You know, you've got characters, but not as much individual voice. So I think, you know, sometimes when things are edited, also things get edited out. So I'm really intrigued by the parts that would have been left on the floor on this part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. For sure. I have a lot of curiosity about the the cutting room floor, so to speak. There's so much there. And sometimes the Midrash tries to fill that in for us when rabbis, both classically and people today, there's a lot of modern Midrash that's happening today, which is really exciting. Um, People try to bring in lots of different pieces, and yeah, there's just so much there. All right, any other comments at this point?
Yeah, I appreciated this comment from Kara or Kara earlier. She says, this reminds me of when my children kvetch, but when I look at their complaints, I must admit they have a point. God is treating the Israelites just like I do with my own kids. Okay, fine, just go to sleep and you'll have fresh baked bread in the morning. And so I thought that I appreciated that parallel.
Yeah, that's good. And I appreciate that as well.
And I think there's just and you spoke to this earlier, Rabbi, where are we obligated to have faith? And when is that just helpful for our own sake, and when is it sort of commanded? So there's lots of conversation about the function of faith and trust in God in the chat.
Yeah, and I actually want to speak to that for a minute, because I mentioned in the beginning of our learning today that I was going to bring in a little bit of the Torah of one of my teachers, Rabbi David Jaffe, who wrote a book in 2016 called Changing the World from the Inside Out, and he's somebody that I work with quite closely. There is a chapter, so in his book, he brings together two different spiritual paths. And those are Musar and Hasidut, which he refers to as Musar as applied Jewish ethics and Hasidut as applied Jewish mysticism. I'm just using the language that is used in that book. There are lots of other ways to translate both of those terms. And one of the chapters that he has is about bitachon, which means trust. And he brings our text as a paradigmatic example of how to apply that. Now, I want to back up, and I want to thank, as I'm doing so, my teacher, Rabbi Dorothy Richmond, also for her teachings on this that I've learned so much from, really thinking about the difference between emunah, which is often translated as faith, and bitachon, which, as I just said, is trust. And this is a paradigmatic example of that because, well, as we see later in this chapter, we've read the beginning of the narrative, but ultimately we're going to receive this manna, and we go out every morning, Sunday to Friday, and get it. And on Fridays, today we would have a double portion, and that double portion will last us through Shabbat. But during the rest of the week, if you gather the manna and you don't eat it, then it spoils, and there's a whole thing about that. And there's a notion of, going out, getting it, being nourished, going out, getting it, being nourished. And in Judaism, and again, like, one Jewish voice, one opinion, three opinions, right? One Jew, three opinions. But I will say that when we think about these terms, emunah and bitachon, as translated as faith, emunah, and trust, bitachon, those are rather loose translations. In the Jewish tradition, as I have come to appreciate and understand it, emunah and bitachon are overlapping and different, and they're both very active, right? So as one of our learners said earlier, it seems like there's a lot of passivity here, and there's not a lot of action, not a lot of agency, right? And in our tradition, we can think about the cultivation of faith and or trust as an active process. This is not, well, if I just have enough faith in Hashem, I'll get the food tomorrow. I have to, in our Parsha, the Bnei Yisrael has to go out and get the food, which is provided every day. But we have to go out and get it. We have to engage with the earth. We have to have that process. as a way of showing us that nourishment is there. It's not about telling us. It's not about, in the intellect, if I just believed enough, right? That's not how the Jewish tradition understands, in my best view, how we connect to the divine. It's not about, I just have to believe in an intellectual capacity or in a spiritual capacity. I just have to believe in a certain way. It's actually a very, very active process. And we do it through choices. There's an idea in Musar called the Bechira point, choice point. And the notion there is that every day human beings have choices, right? Large, small, and those choices are very dependent on obviously so many factors in each one of our lives, right? That are individual, that are collective. There are a lot of different things that have an impact on the choices that we are available to make in any given day, right? No two people have the same access to different choices. The point is that on the base level, we have the ability to make choices. And so, because we have the ability to make choices, what those choices are, there is a certain way in which we are able to exercise agency. We are not, I don't love the word passive. That's the word that just came to me. We are not without our own ability to act in the world. It often feels like it. It often feels like things are so overwhelming. I certainly have felt this a lot recently for lots of reasons, that things are so overwhelming that I'm just numb. And we have choices we can make, right? Bnei Israel had choices in this moment. And also, has been pointed out, by Kara, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, like they are in a place of trying to think of how to say this, because there are a lot of loaded ways to say this, and I want to say this as accurately to the text as possible. They don't yet have trust in their own ability to keep themselves safe and to keep themselves nourished. And I think it's really poignant that we talk about that the narrative of the Torah explores us as one person, right? It's almost like we're one group of undifferentiated people who are complaining. Truth is, and I'm sure this is true in all of our lives, right? It's so easy for us, so easy for me to be like, everyone's complaining about this thing. What if it's really only a couple of people? And I'm thinking about the minute issues in our lives, not the large societal issues. I'm thinking right now about like, somebody's complaining that a class didn't go where they wanted, or they didn't, or there wasn't something at the store or whatever it was. And sometimes we tend to conflate everything into one mass, like this person's complaining. And I want to invite us to ask, as we've done already, what was left out of this narrative? Who are these people who the Torah explains to us were grumbling? Why? What was going on for them? Yes, there were like 3 million people. I think the Torah calculates out, maybe a little bit less than that, who were on this journey. So we had a large mass of people in the wilderness, right? Was it the entire mass of people, or was it only a few people? But regardless of that, it doesn't mean that people's needs are unimportant. It just means, how do we get the bigger picture? And how do we recognize that the people didn't yet have the ability to trust in their own ability to keep themselves safe, which is something that, frankly, a lot of us have experienced in a very visceral way. And in no way do I want to minimize that, because that's a very real human experience that lots of us have experienced in the last many years, in the last year in particular, and even before that. Like, that is a really very real experience. And the question is, when that arises, how do we actually approach it? Rather than saying, oh, as Moses basically does, you all are just a bunch of complainers. Why are you complaining to me? It's not me. I didn't do it. It's not me and Aaron. It's God you're mad at. Here are all the ways that we're going to show you that God is really here for you. It makes sense. Like, Moses is an overwhelmed leader, and we'll see this again next week. Moses is an overwhelmed leader, but how can we kind of give our people a little bit more space, right, to think about what it is that they need, where it is that they've come from, and what they can do to kind of cultivate a sense of trust in themselves, that is an active and ongoing process for sure. And it's not just in the intellect, it's in the doing. You can say, the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea, and that was amazing, but how do we maintain a certain sense of trust in not only in our connection with the divine, but also in ourselves and in our ability to be co-creators with the divine in creating the world anew? I think that this is a real example of that. I'm going to pause there. I'm looking at the time. In our last couple of minutes together, I want to turn it back over to you. I've said a lot today, and I want to hear more from you. Excuse me. If there are comments either in the chat or folks want to unmute, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a round of comments to kind of close us out, and then maybe I'll say a couple of things at the end. But I really want to hear from all of you.
Thank you, and Gesundheit. So I think it's hard to drop questions like this that pose some real deep theological paths for discussion. But Gail says, I wonder if they had a choice to stay in Egypt and not leave with Moses. And I know there's different comments about the percentage and who stayed and who left and what informed those choices. But I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll give the very short version of that. I think it's a really important question. And in fact, people made the choice to stay. So there's a verse I can't remember if it's our Parsha or if it's Parashat Bo, it's one of them, where the Torah talks about the Chamishim, the Torah uses the word Chamishim, which often gets translated as armed. They went up armed from Egypt. But there are others who translate that as relating to the Hebrew word chumash or chamash, which is 5, or chamisha, which is 5, chamesh, chamisha, meaning 1/5. There is a certain strain of commentary that says that only 1/5 of the Israelites went out of Egypt. 4/5 of the community remained, which that in of itself is a really interesting question. How do human beings act in the face of extraordinary circumstances? And from where I sit right now, I try to be really aware and alive and in tune to limits of my own experience as I'm answering these larger questions, because I've come to believe that when we're doing theology, which is, a lot of Jewish thinkers try to veer away from the term theology, although I would argue that we as Jews do engage in theology in a certain way. It's not the same way that Christians do, but there is a very large tradition of Jewish thought, and ways of thinking about these large questions from a very Jewish perspective. I think that we are all deeply informed by the limits of what we've experienced and what we've read and what we've absorbed and what we've heard. And so part of the work that we have to do is get really interested in how other people's experiences got them to where they are. Now, I believe that we always have to do this in a boundaried way, right? Like, there are many situations in our lives in which it's not appropriate. If you are in a situation where there's somebody that's acting really harmfully towards you, if you're in a situation where there's a lot of bullying happening or lots of really harmful behavior, your job in that moment is not to be like, get really curious and understand how this person got there. maybe once that experience has passed and you've resolved it to the way that is available, maybe that's available then. It's not a practice that's available in every situation. When we think about the Torah, it's easy for us to do this kind of practice because we can imagine what were the conditions that resulted in our people making these choices because we are thousands and thousands of years removed. And so when we have the ability to do that, it can be really helpful to think about that. But we have to be really cautious, I believe, of the ways in which the limits of our own subjective experience can sometimes cloud or sometimes really make it hard for us to be able to think or give the most resonant answer for everyone. And that's something that I'm very aware of as I teach Torah, that when I'm teaching and giving over Torah, it's very much informed by the learning that I've done and continue to do. It's also very much informed by my own lived experience, simply because that's the nature of being a human being in the world. And so I think that, yes, to answer the question, there were choices. There is an argument to be made that many of the Israelites made a choice to stay. And I think there's a deeper question here to ask why? What was going on for people? And it causes us to have to really like figure out how human psychology works. So that's the very short answer to a very long and important theological question, which many people have written on.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and we're almost at the end. So are there any final comments before we wrap up?
We have Richard who says many complainers get killed by God in later chapters. We see that both in terms of complaining to Moses and to God. Is there a point where we have clarity on like when you need to stop complaining, or is that all subjective and individualized, or is there a message that we can take about when it's appropriate to complain and when it's not?
So that's another one of those things, right? Where it's like every individual is, going through life and they've got all their stuff and it's all affecting kind of how they show up in different moments. I think what we can say regarding that is that it is such a subjective, I mean, and how we even define complaining is also a really complicated question, right? And I think that, something that I'm really taking away from learning this parasha this year is that the Torah, as we have it, gives us a particular portrait, right? And as Richard mentioned, we're going to get a lot of, I'm thinking about Parashat Korach. I'm thinking about there's an incident in Vayikra. There are incidents in the book of Leviticus. There are incidents, and then we've got, of course, the very famous, infamous, whatever you want to call it, Egel HaZahav coming up in a couple of weeks, the golden calf. This is a theme that keeps repeating itself. And I want to really get curious about the Torah and why it's here. And what can we learn from this about how we are living in this world and how we relate to people in our lives, particularly people in our lives who are really like on our short list, and figuring out like what are the spiritual tools and what are the psychological and emotional tools at our disposal to really be able to do that well. So that's what I've really kind of taken away this year. And there's so much more to learn, so much more to do, but we are at time, and I'm going to wrap it up here. And I wish everyone Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, as always. Thank you to the folks here who shared their wisdom and their questions in the chat. We wish you a Shabbat Shalom and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.